Welcome to Season 1, Episode 5 of A Story Club Global Cultures. This is a unique venture, streaming simultaneously from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, from Dehra Dun in India, and San Francisco in the United States. We speak with people from around the world, trying to understand different cultures, their uniqueness, their problems and their issues, and how we can all learn and work together while remaining grounded in our distinctive cultural matrices. Today's episode is entitled From Kerala, India to Jamaica and Beyond, Writing and Publishing from the Caribbean. My guest is Annie Paul, originally from Kerala in India, but based in Jamaica for over 30 years as a writer, academic editor, and promoter of Caribbean literature. She recently published a biography of the Jamaican-born Stuart Hall, a British Marxist who was a key founder of the globally influential School of Cultural Studies. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you, Kirk.
Great. This sounds much better.
It's
Right.
great
So
to be on your show.
yes, and it's great to have you on. Um, as we had started off last time, let's continue with that, or we can restart. So start from the beginning in terms of a lot of our audience might not know, where you're from, your activities, your background. So why don't we fill them in?
Sure. So I was born and brought up in India, mid-century, and I had never even. It's funny the routes that one's life takes because while in India, I had really never thought about the Caribbean
Yeah.
much,
Hmm.
or at all. Except that there was music coming from the Caribbean. I knew of the Caribbean through music,
Yes.
and I never imagined coming here. But it so ended up that when I finished my studies in India, I finished my master's at Jawaharlal Nehru University. I went to the States, and then a couple of years later, I met my ex-husband, who's Jamaican.
Right.
And so that is how I came to live in Jamaica, not immediately because he was based abroad, but eventually we ended up here in the late 80s, and I've basically been here ever since.
Right.
I've, go
Mhm.
on.
No, no,
Go on.
and you got into publishing, and
That's
yeah,
right.
so
So
yeah, so
I had finished my studies I did a BA in English literature, then a master's in sociology. Then I moved into graphic design, visual art. And at the end of all that, I found I couldn't get a job because, any employer is going to think this girl can't stick with anything, right? So
mhm,
I found it extremely difficult. And I was doing vague things like teaching English and so on, wherever I was, until I came here and sort of fortuitously wandered into the field of publishing and
yes,
found that I was actually ideally equipped for a job in the field of publishing. And
and
so,
mhm.
go on.
No, no, continue.
And so I I ended up becoming the managing editor of Social and Economic Studies, which is one of the, or if not the oldest and most prominent journal coming out of the University of the West Indies. And it's a social science journal. This is something I've been doing now for 30 years. How did I get here? I don't know, but I'll be retiring next year. And as I was saying earlier, so publishing has been my professional home for the last 3 decades, and I will continue to inhabit it, but not at UWI.
Right, right. So yeah, so I was going to remark on that. Yeah, so social and economic studies is basically the flagship journal
Yes.
of the University of the West Indies. All and for listeners and viewers that don't know, the University of the West Indies has campuses on 3 different islands and then sub campuses elsewhere, but Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago. So this is the premier journal that. What's that been like in your experience in editing the the regional universities, I guess, top flagship journal? What's that been like?
It's been fascinating. Initially, I found it very, very difficult to get used to the fact that, you basically have to find your own way. It's
Yeah.
not at the university by this point. I mean, it was very, very great thinking on the university's part to start a journal like this in 1953 and to call it Social and Economic Studies without any qualification of it being a Caribbean journal.
Yeah.
So the ambition was to be a global journal,
Right.
and I think in the first 3 decades of its life, it was started in 1953. So it's almost well, it is yeah, it'll be soon be 70. Um, it really it's take it's all the major university libraries across the world have subscriptions to SES because it's the only source for a certain kind of material coming out of the Caribbean.
And
And
Arthur Lewis, who, and again, for listeners who might not know Arthur Lewis, he was Nobel laureate in economics in 1979 from St. Lucia. And he was it the pro vice chancellor of
well, he
UWI?
was the vice chancellor
The
of
vice
the
chancellor.
University of West
Yeah.
Indies, and
Did
that's
he
who we
start
have
the
on the
journal?
cover. This is a special issue of the journal that has a couple of articles on Arthur Lewis. This is when he was VC, so he was
Right.
young at the time. And sorry, what did you ask about him?
Yeah. Did he start the journal himself? Was it him?
No, no, he wasn't involved with the starting of the journal.
Because
The
he was
journal
at Princeton at the time or something, was he?
maybe I
Yeah.
don't know his trajectory that
Right.
closely, but it was started at the Institute of Social and Economic Research
Right.
by whoever the head was at the time, probably Huggins, I'm not sure,
Yeah.
and the other scholars, and then at that time clearly there was a sense that a university had to have journals.
Yeah.
So we had this journal in over in the Faculty of Humanities. They had Caribbean Quarterly, and then there were some key journals like that. But today, what I have found frustrating in the last decade or two or more or longer is that there's no one thinking about journals strategically across the university and placing them. For instance, we should have bundled our journals by now.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
should,
because for example, I
yeah,
mean, you talked about the early days of social and economic studies, and I mean, there was a whole school of thought coming out of the Caribbean, the plantation model. You had debates, you had Caribbean Marxism coming out of there, and you had the kind of Lloyd Best New World group coming out of there. You had like William Demas, and they were not only talking about the Caribbean, but talking about dependency theory in the whole developing world and the decolonization movement. And the journal, especially in the 60s and going up into the
yeah,
70s, and I probably from the 50s too,
yes,
yeah, would have had, what's that guy who did the special case in Trinidad? Oh, Dudley Sears, right? So you had international economics that would,
oh yeah,
as a first port of call, publish out of social and economic studies.
yes,
So there was
exactly.
that.
It had its grand days, and then in the 80s, somehow it lost its way a bit because it got captured. I put it this way,
Yeah.
that it got captured by econometrists, you know,
Yes.
and it
Yeah,
became
by neoliberalism in general,
yes,
econometrics in specific, but neoliberalism in general. Yeah.
right. And then it became less focused, or it was more focused on one aspect. And of course, it's a journal with such a broad mandate, social and economic studies. The social got left out completely. And so I started editing the journal from 92, and I have a degree, my master's is in sociology. So for me, the mission became how to restore the social in social and economic studies. So, I've had some success. I mean, it's taken years, but finally now I think the journal has a better balance.
Yeah.
And I hope they are able to maintain it. But also after 70 years, I'm saying to the university, it's time to rethink the journals, rethink the mandate of these journals, reposition them. Who is doing that?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. But I mean, because you yourself, I mean, as you said, you will no longer be at the university
Right.
very soon. But you started up small acts. I mean, I was part of
Right.
the initial group there, and I also worked with you in the '90s
Yes.
at SES for a while, and and yeah, so you started off small acts with which is a journal of criticism. Again, the same kind of thing. It's out of the Caribbean, but not necessarily confined only to Caribbean
Right.
studies.
Right.
And then you also have Pree, which you started later on, which is online. So
Yes.
so could you maybe talk about those projects as well?
Sure. Yeah. So Caribbean, I mean, sorry, Small Acts, the Caribbean Journal of Criticism, originally was just Small Acts, a journal of criticism. It was
Yes.
started here by David Scott and me,
Hmm.
but David was the primary, mover and behind it, initiate. It was his intellectual project. I My contribution to that was that I know how to take something from a written on paper stage to the published stage. That's my specialty. So when he said he had this dream of the journal, I was able to say, well, what's stopping you? Let's do it. And so I can't take any credit for the intellectual side of it,
Right.
except that my contribution would also have been a certain focus on visual art, which was had also become somewhat of a specialty for me.
Uh-huh.
So right from the get-go, Small Axe always had space, a lot of space for visual art, and was designed, even its format. I was the production editor. I designed the format of it. Was a broader formats to accommodate more art-based work.
Yes, yes. It looked much more like an arts journal than a
Yeah,
social
that
science journal.
right.
Correct, correct.
And then to Pree now, I had always wanted to have my own magazine. So here I am editing other people's journals or producing other people's journals. So always, obviously, with my, as I accumulated expertise over 3 decades, and also contacts, I knew that I wanted to start a magazine. And so it was a matter of, and I also thought I should do it strategically just a few years before I retire, so that when I retire, I can just seamlessly move on to this new publication, which will be 3 years old by then. And so that is how I set it up. And Pree has been, it is, I also, by the way, was involved with founding the Caribbean Review of Books. So
Right, right. I remember. Yes.
so I
Uh-huh.
have a track history of establishing new publication, which is not easy to do. It's a skill and
Yeah.
maybe a talent. So I just did it with Pree again, and it's we can talk about that a little more. Do you
Yeah,
want to
yeah.
talk about it now or later?
Yeah, sure, sure. Tell us a bit more about
So,
Pre.
yes, so I realized that one way to do the magazine, because at one point I thought I was thinking of a magazine of writing from the South, the global South. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, because I have contacts, I know good writers in India, in South Africa, in the Caribbean, and I thought I should create a platform and get these people to write in it. But that's a very vast project. And as I sort of really started thinking about it, I also, by then, 3 decades of experience, you know that you need to cut your cloth, to suit what you
Yeah.
can manage. So,
That's right.
right? So that's the secret of success. So then I came up with this idea of Pree, and there was this, and also another thing I learned from doing these other ventures was that you need a team. You need. I like to work collaboratively. I'm not
Right.
driven by to be a individual who's this outstanding editor by all by themselves. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
Publishing is a collaborative process. So we found a good team and just went for it. And in the Pree came out the first issue in April 2018. So the idea is that there was no and there was no platform or no visibility for new writers from the Caribbean or in the Caribbean,
Yeah.
or even younger people who are interested in writing. And at the same time, we were in a period where Caribbean writers and particularly Jamaican writers were becoming superstars, like
Yeah.
Alan James,
Yeah.
Kai Miller, Aishan Hutchinson, Nicole Dennis Penn. They're all gaining a lot of visibility all of a sudden. They're all people I've known from long before they were successful writers.
Yeah.
So I thought, I should find a way to leverage all this into the new publication. And so for the first issue, I decided to have a mix of experienced writers and new writers at all by invitation so that we could establish a standard, you know?
Right.
So I basically used my quote unquote Rolodex and put that issue together. And so the vision was that I would always be able to call on these experienced, successful writers to give us something every now and then. That has not proved to be as successful a strategy as I thought because these are writers who don't have much time. They're used to being paid a lot of money. What Pree has grown into is an excellent, it's been very successful. We started in April 2018. Immediately after the first issue, when we went to open subscription, we started getting submissions from all over the Caribbean. That was the other thing. There's no pan-Caribbean or very few pan-Caribbean journals or
Yeah.
organizations. So, I was determined that this should be not just a Jamaican thing. It
Right.
should it's not the way to go at this point. So that from the beginning we started getting really good writing from unheard writers who have not been established yet. And so I found I was vindicated in realizing that there was room and more than room for this kind of training ground, which is what Pree has become for writers. Because what we offer, we can't pay our writers, but what
Right.
we do is we get every piece reviewed by two experienced writers, including some of the superstar writers. So, for
Yeah.
instance, in the next issue, two of the stories are being reviewed by Marlon James, two are being reviewed by Ingrid Prasad, and writers will get feedback. And most of what we published is revised after it's very few of the submissions make it as is. Some do,
Right.
some do. So it has now become a kind of, so when, the word pre, when we named it pre, we were referring to the slang to look at, look at
Right.
this, look at. But now I'm thinking that it's actually perfect because what we're doing is pre-publication
Right.
training.
Yeah.
So a
It's
lot
like an apprenticeship almost
it
in
is,
some ways.
and
Yeah.
and, and many of the and we also what got bumped this year because of COVID was a writing studio. We were going to have our first writing studio in May, just before Calabash Literary Festival, and I had lined up all the superstars: Marlon James, Kai Miller, Aishan Hutchinson, Ingrid Prasad, um, two others. I can't remember all the names, but the big names. And the
Yeah.
idea was that we wanted to see if we could offer the world the Caribbean's best, how
Yeah.
whether there would be take up. And at the time, we visualized this and conceptualized it. Well, it was all mine, by the way. This was something I did by myself, without much help from the rest of the team. And so I thought if we can get 20 people to pay, because of course we would have to charge a fee.
Yeah.
We
Mhm.
set the fee at 1,000 US, and I thought, okay, if I can get 20 people to come, that'll be great. We got more than 40 people willing to pay and come.
Right. And from all
So
over the world, or is it from
they were
mainly the Caribbean?
mostly people with connections to
Yeah.
Jamaica,
Hmm.
but I mean, sorry, to the Caribbean.
Yeah.
But there were a couple of people, writers with no connection to the Caribbean, except that they were writing maybe novels that had a Jamaican character, and they saw the benefit of coming and working with
Yeah.
someone like Marlon. So there were people like that, and that was so exciting.
Yeah.
And so we will hold it next May, and it can become a way of sustaining Pree, because the whole point for us, the quandary has been, how do we sustain something like this? It's digital, open access. Where do we get? Because being paid. It's a lot of work,
Yeah.
right? And we need to be able to.
Yeah, to monetize it is a. I mean, and this is, I suppose, an issue we can talk about that I'd like to talk about, in terms of publishing from the Caribbean, writing from the Caribbean. People have had to go abroad. Like CLR James or V.S. Naipaul. Derek Walcott was able to maintain a base here in Trinidad actually for a while, and be back and forth between Boston here, but eventually he had to go abroad. And then many of the stars you mentioned, abroad, and then they, as you said, they get paid a lot over there, and they can't get paid down here. Obviously that's a challenge to overcome. And New York is you know one of the centers, London, of course, maybe out in California as well, but certainly London and New York are. And you have the networks, and you go to lunch and you meet people, and you don't have that when you're publishing out in the periphery, as we are. Yet now, with COVID, and James Altucher, I don't know if you know him, he wrote a blog about how, well, a piece, a column actually, about how New York City is now dead. People are moving out, and the whole landscape is changing. Everybody is doing things remotely now. This show is, people from all over the world coming in. So, what are your thoughts on this? The old geography of publishing, and the center and the periphery, and how things might be changing. What your challenges were, and yeah, and going forward, you think it's actually might be better now that things are so getting much more decentralized?
Just yeah, yes, because having trouble hearing.
Yes,
Hello.
yes, right.
Yeah. Um, Understand decentralization is good. Uh, Obviously, how could we get it was so expensive to print something, to go out there and be disseminated. So dissemination is much to find a revenue model that that's not so easy. Us, I mean, it's affected publishing. It's not to be developed. They're not just be found. They have to actually, come in gradually with because you say, geography of publishing has changed and so on. Yet UK writes world, which is in this day and age
Yeah.
the way it is. There is still a lot of territoriality and control of
Yeah.
publishing.
Well, we're missing a lot of what you're saying. The connection seems to have gone bad since I asked the question. um,
But no,
it was great before, right up to the question, but I missed a lot of missed 90% of what you were saying in your response
can
to
you
the
hear me?
question.
Should I repeat it?
I Yeah, I'd like you to repeat it, but
More
yeah,
faithful,
but
yes.
the connection is still sounding bad.
Oh,
Let's try it again. And I know you talked about, I all I could pick up really was that territoriality is still there. But yeah,
yeah.
why don't we
So
start over?
the because it entities in the Caribbean to make themselves visible to the rest of the world, which is
Yeah,
great, right? But how do we still need to find revenue models for these kinds of platforms
yeah,
to sustain ourselves, because otherwise it's dependent on free labor,
Yes.
and that's not fair. Then I was saying, you mentioned something about how this decentralization has changed publishing. Can you hear me? I can tell when you can't hear me.
Yeah,
Think about
I'm just picking up like 50% now, which is better than better than the 10%, but still it's 50%.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Yeah, so the geography has not really changed that much,
right.
because the big publishers, the rights to books are still sold in the separately to the US and
Yep.
separately to the UK. And then they have this catch-all rest of the world.
Yes, that's right.
And
I'm
so,
hearing you much better. Hmm.
so we need to-
I just jinxed it.
Okay, so so having
Okay. All right. Um, all right. So, all right. I unfortunately, I missed a lot, but what I did get was about an interesting thing you said about free labor, the monetization problem, and the fact that, yeah, the rights are still territorial. You have the rest of the world, this category, the that is so vague and unfocused, and I suppose that's probably part of the lack of concentration or focus in this, which is why these ventures need to be done. Um, but you mentioned free labor, which is interesting, coming from a former slave, from a
exactly.
from slave colonies, right? Providing free labor for these international industries. So it's kind of interesting, the patterns recurring and keeping it. Let me ask you now something about your Indianness and
Mhm.
the Caribbean, right? Because you are originally from India,
Right.
but and and you find this a lot, like at the university, you'll find maybe a Canadian coming in to head up
Yeah.
the university press,
Mhm.
and there are nationalist issues that come up. I mean, in the United States, in Europe, no, nationalism is a bad word, it's evil. But in the rest of the world, it's not,
Right.
and I think it's healthy for
Mhm.
us to have these feelings, especially after histories of colonialism and being marginalized. We're the rest of the world, instead
Yes.
of being, Jamaica or Trinidad or the Caribbean or India or Kerala or wherever. Um,
Mhm.
and we need to have our identities um, validated, known, explored, developed, all these sorts of things. But yeah, so so what I wanted to ask, you did say that the Pree was you intended it to be a much wider thing, to incorporate your links to
Mhm.
India, South Africa, elsewhere, but for very practical purposes, you had to cut your cloth accordingly. But what sort of links do you maintain? A lot of your links, have you lost it all? Do you consider yourself, fully Caribbean and Jamaican now, or how do you navigate the worlds that you inhabit and come from?
I know I don't consider myself fully Caribbean or Jamaican at all. I am not. So, but I'm very comfortable here. And I maintain links big time. I've been going to India every other year in the last 2 decades, because my parents, they were aging. My
Yeah,
dad passed away in 2015, but my mother is still there. So I was just in India in December, January this year. And what is fantastic is that I told you I went to JNU.
hmm,
I did my master's in sociology at the Center for the Study of Social Systems. And that class, someone took the initiative to start a WhatsApp group just for the classmates. So not even all the classmates, but some groups that used to kind of, that he thought would kind of be able to talk to each other. And that was started in April. And we have not stopped talking, um, chattering every single day until now. And I
Yeah.
think the COVID thing has helped.
Yeah.
We've had a couple of Zoom calls, and and what's interesting about this group is that, so I have over the years kept in touch with all those who, like myself, left India and moved to the US or Canada, or,
Yeah.
exceptionally to the Caribbean. So but I didn't have much contact with the ones who stayed at home, but now I do, through this group, And so the group consists of those of us who stayed behind and some of us who went abroad,
Yeah.
and we're all chatting, and it's really very, very cool, And
Yeah.
I have a lot of other links. I have, um, because I go frequently, and Tejaswini Niranjana.
Yes.
Through her, I got to know her networks. I have other friends with their networks, and so I am very connected. And over here, um, yeah, it's just something that happened, that I never make plans, Kirk.
Yeah.
I'm not a 5-year planner or even a 1-year planner. Maybe at this age I've become a 1-year planner. At least
Yeah.
that is true. But so things that have happened to me have not happened by plan, but
Right.
I've been able to make the most of them. And I really, I think at the end of my career, looking back, that I just marvel at the right choices I seem to have made along the way.
Well,
Uh,
you've recently completed a biography, a
right,
short biography of Stuart Hall,
right,
Jamaican-born Marxist, a cultural studies theorist, and I mean he was exploring a lot of these issues before it was
fashion,
trendy. He
right,
he he got them. He was very much part of the reason why we talk about cultures and its interaction with politics and history in the way we do, by
right,
pioneering so much of this type of research he was doing in England.
right.
But could you tell us a bit about how you got involved in the project? What Stuart Hall meant to you, how it even might relate to you personally, not
Mhm.
not only in terms of your relationship with him, because I know he was somewhat of a mentor to you, but also in terms of you reflecting on your experience by the questions he raised in his work.
Right. So I'll talk about how I came to do it. Now, it would never. Yes, I've known Stuart personally since 1996. We were close friends, kept in touch with calls whenever I passed through London, I would see him. Um, but um, but it would never have occurred to me to write a biography of Stuart Hall. Never.
Hmm. Right.
But what happened is that the previous director of the university press was initiating the Caribbean biography series, and she's the one, Linda Speth, who had the idea of including Stuart Hall in the list of intellectuals or um, key Caribbean figures whom they wanted to produce these biographies of. And in fact, she wanted me to inaugurate the series with the one on Stuart Hall, which she thought would take me 3 to 6 months to write, because they're short. They're supposed to be no more than 25,000 to 30,000 words. Mine is actually 35,000, but it took me 4 years,
Hmm.
and partly I think because I knew him, I just was daunted at the thought of doing justice to this figure, and not,
Hmm.
yeah, whatever. Anyway, what motivated me was also the fact that he's hardly known in the
Yeah.
land where he was born and brought up, in Jamaica. He left here at the age of 19, but he was formed here.
Yes. Hmm.
And so I took this as an opportunity to try and illuminate the Jamaican input into Stuart Hall, his childhood here, and of course, the material is not easy to come by, but fortunately, he had just written and published his own autobiography, which covers his early years. So I used some of the information from there, but I just didn't want to just reproduce that. So I did a lot of research in the Gleaner and the archives here. He went to Jamaica College. So, there are ways in which I was able to do it. But one of the interesting things I found, which isn't mentioned anywhere else, is that at the age of 18, as he graduated from Jamaica College, he went to a summer institute at Knox College, which is a high school, on adult education. You know, it was, and he was working there part time, just instead of sitting at home. But so my point is, he was exposed to the idea of adult education here in Jamaica
Yeah.
that summer, you know. And then, of course, as you know, he goes on to become, amongst many other things, one of the stalwarts of adult education in the UK
Yes.
at the Open University, right?
Yeah.
So I tried to show those connections. What I also have, which is not available anywhere else, I had access to his early unpublished fiction and unpublished political essays and so on. So I have reproduced some of them. So you can read Stuart Hall's fiction, you know, uh,
Right.
parts of it, not the entire thing, but huge chunks of it. In some
But
instances.
for those people who don't know Stuart Hall,
Yeah.
listening here, well, what would you say are, the the most important things that people should know and about him and his work?
Right. Well, most people know him as for his pioneering work in the field of cultural studies, which, if people don't know what that is, it was a disruptive new technology of scholarly inquiry that he was very instrumental in founding in the 70s at the University of Birmingham in England. And this, it turned traditional disciplinary production of knowledge on its head
Yeah.
eventually, right? In the early days, it got a real fight, and probably still in some places still gets a fight. But now it's pretty much mainstream. You know,
Yeah.
cultural studies has been mainstreamed.
Yeah.
But
And just to sort of elaborate on that, yeah, like, I mean, he would be talking about a lot about the immigrant experience, and it would be like mixing culture and politics and popular culture. So you did have people like Eric Hobsbawm, who might talk about the English working class and their traditions and folk traditions, but then he and his colleagues would bring in things like talking about rude boys in London,
right,
or the ska
yeah,
movement, or
that's right.
yeah,
We were
yeah,
not interested in the distinction between high culture and low culture,
yeah,
which had prevailed till then. But the other main thing about Stuart was that he was a Marxist. From his schoolboy days, he was exposed to Marx here at Jamaica College, became a Marxist, never became a member of the Communist Party because he detested ideological thinking.
yeah,
And so he was also very involved in trying to get the old school Marxists and communists to rethink their views about the masses, the quote unquote masses.
yes,
He said, you can't just talk about them, you have to study their culture.
yeah,
Their culture is popular culture. So that was the main subject of study at the Cultural Studies Institute at Birmingham. One of the main. He was also very interested in political culture and
yeah,
so many
yeah,
things like that. And
yeah. Because I mean, it was a lot of ways it was like what was going on with the Frankfurt School, the way they started to talk about culture, and then later on, like subaltern studies in India. So
right,
talking about the people and culture that academics sort of ignored.
that's right.
Yeah, but it was, um, yeah,
And he theorized the notion of diaspora,
yes, that's
right?
right. And the immigrant experience
Immigrant
in the
experience was
UK.
integral to that. And but he always spoke about these things and wrote about these things in ways that they were applicable globally.
Yeah,
Even though he was talking about Britain and Caribbean immigrants to Britain,
yeah,
that same what he was articulating could be applied much more broadly, which is why his work travels so easily and so well. But he primarily, he also, although he was an intellectual, he also was an activist. And one
Mhm.
of his ambition, he thought that thinking is not just for academics to do at university. Everyone should be able to do it. There, and he was very committed to the idea of organic intellectuals,
Yeah.
and saw his own work as enabling people to become organic intellectuals.
Yeah, 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 and I mean the Open University would have been very much part of that, and I mean,
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah, I mean, people here, people outside of the UK might not know what the Open University is, but
That's
since when did it start, in the 60s or from
Yeah,
before?
I think no, so the 60s is safe. I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah, and that was, distance learning using television and mail-in,
Reaching people where they are or where
yeah,
they were, rather
yeah,
than making them come. It was very ahead of its time.
yeah,
And
yeah.
Stuart was a key, very integral part and influential figure at
That's
that
it.
Open University.
And then they were doing pioneering work, because a lot of the issues that later became popular with postmodernism and stuff, they had been talking about that a long time, in their own way, and then fusing it with things like anti-colonial struggles in a way that the postmodernists didn't really, except maybe
Right. I
Algeria a
mean,
bit.
the funny thing is, he was often accused of being a postmodernist when he was anything but a postmodernist. But that's, people don't understand these terms and they just like to throw them around.
Yes.
But that's not what. But the other thing about him was that he thought that representation was very important because in the construction of the world, for instance, it's not that the world is, we were taught, I know I was taught at school, that the physical world consisted of animate objects and inanimate objects, and Stewart and others were more insistent that no, it's not as simple as that. So it's not just what you see out there, but it's a constellation of social constructions of what we're looking at. And even the nation state, for instance, he thought was a system of representation.
Yeah.
It's not an actual, when you talk about reality, in other words, reality for him was socially constructed. And the work of intellectuals is to take that apart and make it visible. Otherwise, it appears to be this seamless common sense. Everything is the way we see it and the way it's presented to us. And he was interested in equipping people with ways to take that, what they were presented with, apart, and enabling themselves in the process, allowing them to exert their power, limited as it might be on a situation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all those things about like micro politics and which later became called that. Yeah, they were pioneering that. Now, since we have a much better connection now, and we lost so much of what you were saying before, I think we can tie the two things in, perhaps. Um, you know, the things Stuart Hall talked about and conceptualized, to help us. I suppose. I suppose his goal was, I don't know if liberation is exactly the word, but certainly, removing, the subtle oppressions, or not so subtle oppressions that that exist. And in terms of your projects, your life projects of publishing, what we were talking about,
Right.
publishing from the Caribbean, the
Mhm.
difficulties in monetizing the kind of free labor provided in a sense, to the global publishing industry, the way the global publishing industry is divided into its kind of provinces, the
Yes, that's
English
right.
world, the UK, the US, and the rest of the world. Um, do you see any sort of relevance of the types of things he talked about and your experiences as a publisher from the third world?
And this is why with me so much,
Uh-huh.
and it's
I'm laughing because the connection
one
got worse again.
give up.
Oh, it's like that. It's like those questions
Mhm.
sort of motivate a technical error in the matrix somehow. Oh, you know, unfortunately, I think okay. If we cannot get this, I think we may have to leave it here. But let's see if you can. Let's try it again. It's looking a little better.
Okay,
So
can you hear me
I
now?
can hear you. I can hear you. Let's continue.
And I'm trying to remember.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
I
was,
know, no, you don't have to repeat it.
yeah.
I remember. And I was saying that my clearly why Stuart Hall resonated with me much, and why we, for our friendship, had so much in common in terms of being interested in publishing,
Hmm.
uh, publishing as a kind of political act,
Yes.
you know, and more than that as well. But literature was enough for both of us. His people don't realize that Stuart never didn't have a PhD, never completed his PhD, but which was on famous American. So he appreciated the importance and usability of literature, or applicability of literary insights in. So he all, for instance, at the age of 20, writing an essay arguing why the humanities need to talk more to the and the social sciences and the humanities need to be more talking to each other much more, and this is long before he goes to Birmingham or anything like that. He's already talking about thinking of these demolishing these disciplinary boundaries.
Right, right, right.
And that was of interest to me too. This is why I had skipped from one thing to the other and so on. So there are all these connections, yes, and ability to relate to what he still
What
stands
was
for.
he influenced at all by CLR James while he was in Jamaica? Because there's so many overlaps with James. But I don't know if he would have been
No,
aware of it from
there's
Jamaica.
a famous, I'll send you a link,
Hmm.
Stewart interviewing, which I quoted in my editorial, um, because James was important to him. They weren't, there was a discrepancy in ages. CLR's from generation, maybe two generations earlier than Stewart.
Uh-huh.
But he thought very highly of him. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's very similar. But Annie, I think because of the technical problems,
Yeah.
I think we should bring this to a
Wind up.
close.
Yeah.
Sadly, because there are a lot of issues that I would have liked to explore further. Perhaps there might be another occasion, or
I hope so. Yeah.
yeah,
That
yeah,
would be
where
great.
we'd
Yeah.
be able to do so. But I think that I like the point you made, and I think we can close up on that, which is publishing itself is a political act, and publishing from Jamaica is a political act itself. You have to deal with network problems, with
Yes.
communication problems, with
Yes.
technology, with money, and instead of throwing it up and say, oh well, look, I will try to do this from New York or wherever, you might have an opportunity to do so. It's no, we're going to do it here despite the problems, despite the apathy, despite the which goes to the education problem, despite the economic problem, despite the technological problem, that all of this stuff is
Yes.
actually linked together, and that this struggle to get this thing published, to get people, Caribbean people, to write and to see it as a profession, to think and to write and to let their voices be heard from where they are. That itself is a political struggle that you've been involved in
Right.
practically for 30 years, and I think that's a great insight. Uh,
Great.
if we can get a last word as we close, are you working on anything right now else that you'd like our audience to know about?
No, the other thing I would have mentioned was Pree,
Good.
and we've already talked about that. Yeah,
Excellent, excellent. And they can find that. Is it pree.com? Pree
Pree,
dot com?
Preelit, Preelit.com,
Oh,
preelit.com.
okay. Well,
Okay,
that's great. Thanks very much.
thank
It
you.
yeah, it's been fascinating and interesting, although technically challenging. As I said, we'll make up for that later. But it's been a
Fantastic.
pleasure having you on the program. Thanks, and
Thank you, and thanks to any listeners who persisted despite the technical challenges. Thanks a lot. And
thank you.
bye bye. Take
All right.
care.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of A Story Club Global Cultures. We were talking with our guest Annie Paul on the topic From Kerala, India to Jamaica and Beyond, writing and publishing from the Caribbean. I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for watching and listening and persisting. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, like, share, and tell your friends about us. Thanks again, and see you next week.